thank you for being here at the CGSI panel for Migration and Health. We're talking today about the intersection of social determinants of health and refugee seeking and migration, as well as migration as a social determinant of health specifically. Our audience might be either undergraduate students or graduate students, so I'm just going to give a really brief introduction to both those concepts to frame the panel. The health inequalities in the world that are avoidable arise because of circumstances in which people grow, live, work, age, and then the systems put in place to deal with illness. So these conditions are shaped by political, social, and economic forces. So for example, the infrastructure in urban and rural areas has consequences. There's inequitable access to water, sanitation, electricity, or paved streets that affects the health of the population. And traditionally, when you think of social determinants of health, you think of housing, education, healthcare, jobs, and neighborhood conditions. So though there is research on immigrant populations in public health and social work contexts, there's been very little focus on migration or refugee status as a social determinant of health. So today we're going to talk more about this trend towards applying the lens of social determinants of health to migration and about practicing as a social worker with migrant and refugee populations. But first, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So joining me is Dr. Megan Berthold, an associate professor at University of Connecticut. Her areas of specialization include torture, war and other traumas, post-traumatic stress reactions, mental health, refugees, asylum seekers and immigrants, cross-cultural clinical work, international social work, and human rights and social justice. Also here is Dr. Marciana Popescu, an associate professor at Fordham University. Dr. Popescu has conducted research around migration policies in the EU and the US, the impact of migration policies on women refugees, and the securitization of borders and the impact of border control on social identities. And finally is Dr. Mitra Nasseh, whose area of scholarship focuses on well-being, inequality, and poverty among minorities with migration backgrounds. She's previously worked as a staff member of non-governmental organizations and the United Nations offices in the Middle East and South Asia. Professors, thank you so much for joining me. I'm wondering if you'd be first willing to introduce yourselves briefly as researchers and practitioners. Dr. Popescu, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting us. And you already said everything about us. There is not that much more to add. But yes, I'm a professor, associate professor at Fordham University, and I worked on women's rights throughout my career in different capacities with different organizations internationally in the US. And more recently, I shifted my focus to really looking at displaced populations and then at forced migration and the impact of forced migration on women. And more recently, as you can see from my logo here, I'm very proud of it. We are conducting a project that started last year and is continuing, and we're working on actually creating sustainability that really looks exactly at what you are asking us about today. What is the impact of migration on health and mental health? And more importantly, how do women with lived experiences of forced migration face these challenges? What can we learn from them so we can respond better to the challenges that they are facing and inform better the policies that are supposed to, to be in place to protect them?
Thank you so much, Dr. Berthold.
Great. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. So before I joined UConn's faculty, I was working as a clinician with refugees and asylum seekers since the mid-'80s, mostly in Los Angeles, but also in 3 different refugee camps in 3 different countries in Asia. And also, once I started to work, I was mainly working with nonprofits. In the late 1990s, I began to work with torture survivors from many different countries. Prior to that, I was working pretty much exclusively with Southeast Asian refugees. And I also have had the chance to do a lot of forensic work with survivors of torture and other asylum seekers, which has really informed my understanding of the impact of the traumas and other experiences that cause them to flee their countries, and the impact on their health and well-being. I also have several lines of my research. I've been doing research with Cambodian genocide survivors since the mid-1990s, mostly documenting the impact of genocide and various health disparities for mental health and physical health conditions. But my more recent work with Cambodians has been a series of community-based participatory research studies that engage community members, community health workers, to do interventions with individuals at risk for or living with cardiometabolic disease and other health disparities. Some of this work has spanned the United States and Cambodia, linking community health workers rurally to train and support village health workers in rural Cambodia. I also do research with diverse torture survivors through our National Consortium of Torture Treatment Providers. And one of the things that I think is most relevant to our conversation today, I've devoted some line of my scholarship to promoting trauma-informed and human rights-based approaches to clinical social work with diverse traumatized migrant and asylum-seeking populations.
Thank you so much. I hope we get to hear more about that. So now, if Dr. Mishra-Nasseh is willing to please introduce herself and briefly describe some of her contributions in her area of research or practice.
Thank you. Yes, I'm an early career researcher, and my area of scholarship focuses on well-being and multidimensional poverty among minoritized and racialized groups. I also have an interest in neurodegenerative conditions, specifically cognitive conditions associated with trauma caused by forced migration. My work, my research is heavily impacted and guided by my previous work experience with refugees and immigrants in 9 different countries as part of my work with non-governmental organizations and United Nations offices. Over the past years, I have disseminated my research on immigrants and refugees well-being through 25 peer-reviewed publications, 3 book chapters, and a co-authored book, Best Practices for Social Work with Refugees and Immigrants, which is a textbook in many universities for elective courses on immigrants and refugees. In terms of service, I serve as a member of the CSWE task force to advance anti-racism, and I'm serving as the SSWR Immigrants and Refugees Cluster co-chair.
Thank you. And Dr. Nasseh's book will also be in the link with the other books that we talked about. For the second question, I was thinking we could do slightly more discussion-based responses. So the question is, what are the ways migration status can affect a person's well-being?
Perhaps I'll start by saying there are so many different factors. I see Marciana agreeing with me on this, that can affect this. One that leaps out at me as being critical is how secure the person's migration status is. Is it a temporary status? Are they living in the US or their country of refuge with an undocumented status? Do they have a formal legal refugee status? Perhaps they are an asylum seeker or a US citizen or lawful permanent resident. To make a long story short, what I've learned from working with individuals across these and other legal statuses is that their legal status can contribute to either a sense of relative safety or a continued extreme fear, for example, a fear of being deported. So many of the asylum seekers, who again were torture survivors, have taught me about the ongoing stress that they feel that affects not only their psychological well-being, but their physical health as well. Because until their asylum cases are resolved, in a positive way, which can take years. I've worked with people who are in that process for 15 years with no resolution to their case. They still live in fear of being deported, where they can fear being persecuted, tortured again, or killed. And unfortunately, I've had a number of clients whose loved ones were either had to live in hiding back in the home country, or some of them were tortured and or assassinated because the authorities mainly the military, police, secret police, were looking for the person, their prime target, the person who had fled and sought refuge elsewhere. But I want to also make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that even after these individuals flee from their home countries, Many times, although they're seeking refuge and safety, they sometimes don't find that. So having worked in refugee camps and displaced persons camps myself and hearing from those I've served, those camps can be very violent and unsafe places. And also, even after resettling, say in the United States or some other countries, they may experience additional violence, threats, bullying, or discrimination in these settings. And that contributes to the complex picture of factors that I think contribute to their health and well-being. I'm going to pause there. I want to hear from you, Martiana.
Sure. And I have to say, I'm always so impressed and humbled by all the experiences that you had that are informing your practice and your scholarship. It's amazing. And you touched on many points I had in mind too, but like this one point that I think looms large when we talk about the impact of a legal status on health and mental health is uncertainty, and you pointed to that. And the other associated element there is stress. So when we're talking about forced migration, people that are forced out of their communities into new territories, unknown territories, are really marked by a significant level of stress. I mean, whenever we choose to move voluntarily, there is a level of stress involved. Whenever we are facing change, there is a level of stress. Imagine people that from one day to the next need to leave, need to flee, need to run. And then they rely on international instruments. And that's my huge pet peeve, right? International instruments that were put there, created to protect them, yet we are failing them again and again and again. So they are dealing with trauma and health and mental health care issues in their country of origin, many times due to factors that are contributing, like push factors that are pushing them out, right? Then they are dealing with trauma, health issues, mental health issues, like just think of reproductive health, to say the least, as they are moving from one country to another. And then they reach the destination, whatever that destination is, and they still are dealing with uncertainty and stress. The other element that I would like to add here is, on one hand, we are dealing with all these health issues, right? And factors causing this health and mental health issues. On the other hand, we are dealing with systemic issues. So there is a stark problem with accessing health and mental health care throughout the migration journey. Right? And then people arrive here and they are assigned a status, either formally or informally, that is saying really very little about their lives. And based on that status, they are assigned rights. So if you are an asylum seeker and you applied for asylum, you have some sets of rights. If you are an asylee, some more rights are being added to that. If you are coming in with a refugee status, at least in theory, you have some other rights. But what if you are an asylum seeker de facto, not de jure? Someone that got here and they know, look at the conflict in Ukraine right now, they cannot go back. So they need to apply for asylum, but they are afraid because they know what it means in the United States to apply for asylum. Years of waiting and uncertainty and no ability to really access jobs, even when you have an employment authorization, because employers are reluctant to hire you and so on and so forth. So when you're sick, where do you go? Do you even care that you are sick? No, that's not the first of your priorities. Do you catch the signals when you are dealing with mental health issues? No. And in many cases, what we call mental health issues are actually normal responses to extremely abnormal conditions that this population is going through. So I'll stop here for now.
Very much so. I just wanted to pick up on some of that. It's so important what you shared. Another thing that I've been really impressed by with the survivors who I've worked with is that often being forced to flee one's country can challenge one's sense of self and identity. Especially, there's so many things that have been lost. Your homeland, your culture, for many, your identity in society, perhaps even your professional self, and often having to leave family behind. And sometimes as we've seen in this current crisis in Ukraine and in many others, that uncertainty of even knowing what happened to your loved one.
Yeah.
And that can be very agonizing. One of the things that we know from clinical work and also the research literature is that those individuals, for example, who were tortured or otherwise persecuted because of their identity, such as being a woman or a girl or a man, fighting for women's rights in their country, and they were persecuted, being lesbian, gay, transgender, and fighting for those rights, and being persecuted as a result, being a political activist, that many times it can, it may throw a person into a state of crisis. I'm also thinking of those I've worked with who were lay or spiritual leaders or religious leaders in their home country and were persecuted as a result. But what we know from the literature is that reconnecting with one's identity and sense of self seems to be very protective in terms of health and well-being. And there's so many opportunities in this. The last point I want to make is that there are enormous resilience and strength in individuals who are forced to flee their homelands. And one of the ways that they may reconnect with their identity or find other meaningful purposes in their lives is by engaging and helping others. And I've seen that time and time again, such as with the community health workers who I've had the great opportunity to work with, or even when we had groups of torture survivors in our torture treatment center, having individuals interpret for others, within that group, and helping to make that connection.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And, thank you for pointing to that identity loss issue, which is huge. And, what we learned from the work we are doing now with her Migrant Hub is that, one of the first things that the amazing women activists, which are most of them are asylum seekers, some just recently received asylum, and some are from Venezuela, so you don't know if it will be asylum or temporary protective status, and they are still navigating those waters. But one of the first comments that was made when we started working with them and really starting to really step back and acknowledge the value that they are bringing and the expertise and the understanding, and really we wanted to focus on them and their stories. And one of the women in the group said, how can we help others? That's my question. How can we use whatever we do here to help others? And that was the mantra, and that's healing. But that's also extremely humbling, when you are on this other side. And, we're thinking, unfortunately, many of us still think that we are here as saviors. And it's a problem in social work in particular. We're not called to save anyone. We're called to learn and humbly acknowledge what people are bringing to the table, listen, and then work with them because they have so much to offer.
Absolutely. I think that actually segues us really well into one of our questions where we know that acculturation has been shown to have adverse effects on immigrants, and it comes in lots of forms, including forced acculturation or acculturation that overlooks cultural circumstances that are different, especially with social work, like you mentioned. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how social workers can avoid accidental acculturation of migrant and refugee clients.
Well, thank you for raising this question. This is another area that is rather controversial. And, my sociological background brings in all this conceptual frameworks in which you can talk in migration, policy, for example, about one of the main goals being integration, right? And that's where we should be. However, US policies never aimed for integration when it came to migration, right? The other purpose that was presented was assimilation or acculturation, if you want, because unfortunately, the two became a little bit too close, synonymous words. And it is a problem because when you try to tell others through the policies, through the programs, or through the lack of programs, that all you need to do in order to succeed here is to become like us, you are actually continuing to deny their identity, telling them, this is not good enough. The way you dress, the way you talk, think of language, and language has a huge impact. I mean, there is an entire, like field that we did not dive in enough, and that is the linguistics of migration and how language is so powerful. Well, now bring this into social work, the language of social work, right? So when you're talking about mechanisms for integration, I would prefer to say we are talking, unfortunately, too much about mechanisms of acculturation. One skill that was stressed in social work education again and again and again was what? Cultural competence. I don't know about you, but I don't know of anyone that is truly culturally competent, even in our own cultures, because cultures are complex. And there's so many moving parts. And what culture am I looking at? I mean, think of the reality we are living in. I am, from Romania. That culture, do I understand it fully? What part of the Romanian culture do I really know, right? I lived for the past 20 some years in the United States. That culture, what part, like American culture, what's that? I mean, think of how many, cultures are represented here, right? So then you come in as a professional and you are saying, we need to develop cultural competence. And that's the wrong way to look at it. So, when you're really talking about the integration, what that means is we need to train social workers and to train ourselves. I mean, it all starts with us and train others. The fact that we need to step back and really move even further than cultural sensitivity, that's a somewhat better term, and enter the territory of cultural humility, stepping back, allowing others to teach us about their culture and what is beautiful in the culture, what is dear to them, what are the values they want to hold on to, because it is what defines them. Right? How much in social work education, and don't even get me started, in field education in social work, are we spending to really make this? How much time are we spending to really make this happen? It's not us. It's not our voices that need to be heard. And here I am contradicting myself. I'm speaking about it. And many times, this comes there are others that could speak better about this because they would speak from their own experiences. But I think if we want to shift the paradigm, we need to start from practice, micro levels of practice, all the way to macro levels. And that's how you change policy. So at the micro level, Megan can say much more and much better than me about trauma-informed care and the importance of trauma-informed care. But at the core of trauma-informed care, it's a recognition for the other person's story, for what they think it's valuable and important and what they want to hold on to, right? Then you go into meso level, working with organizations. What is the language that we use? What are the practices that we use? Are they trauma-informed? Are they culturally sensitive, at least? Right? Creating a space where people can feel they are valued for who they are. And then moving into the macro level policies. And here I can't not bring up an example. So the US, as I said, never focuses on integration. We don't care if people have access to language trainings. In New York City alone, we found out, although there is no clear data because we're not doing a good job in, really having consistent migration data globally, not only in the US, but we found out that about 200,000 people in New York City alone are here from Central and South America, and they are not speaking Spanish, not English, Spanish, because they are coming from indigenous communities. Yet we expect them, acculturation versus integration, we expect them to learn, but do we offer programs that are free of charge in places where they feel safe to go without making too many inquiries about who they are and what is their legal status? That's what needs to change. And then there is the example of Germany that does significantly better, not on all fields, right? But when you are focusing on integration, you need to have free language classes, access to education and higher education, extremely important, right? Create paths, dedicate funds, because you can have the policy and no funds allocated and you do nothing, right? And then opportunities, create opportunities in which people can come and share. We can all join in as professionals and learn about each other's cultures. Now, Germany is not there with the third one, but they are making great progress on the first and the second. So as social workers, I think it is our ethical responsibility as rights-based practitioners to really focus on integration. And part of that, forget acculturation. Think about, how do we really respect the other person? How do we really focus on the dignity and worth of individuals, which is what we say it's a value in social work. But is it in our practice? I'm stopping here.
Very well said. I agree with you.
Genuine understanding and genuine belief in the fact that there is value in any culture, and respecting that, forgetting about these misleading concepts like developing or developed countries, having this notion that we are the developed and we know more, or first world, third world. We are global south, global north. We are all connected and there is value in any culture. And actually practicing valuing other culture. And it's not like here we are center of the world and we are the standard. So creating this feeling that others need to comply with our standards and our value, instead showing interest and respect about way of being in other cultures.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And again, I think that was a great connection to there's lots of social work students that could be watching this that are in field education right now, that are being trained with clients in micro level interactions. So I'm wondering if Dr. Berthold, you'd be willing to answer our next question. How can social workers be better prepared to respond to the health of immigrant and refugee communities as these populations grow in the United States, and as a group of clients that you may have will of course include migrants and refugees, even though you may not be working in a migrant specific organization?
Thank you for that question. And I'm so glad you added that last part of the question, because I totally agree with you that if you're working in, a wide range of agencies, you may well, encounter refugees or asylum seekers or other forced migrants, and you may never know unless you ask and unless you really create a good connection, a safe enough space for them to open up and share about what they've been through. So there's a lot of ground one could cover here, but I'm going to focus on a few things. First, I have found it so valuable to work as part of interdisciplinary teams with and this would include working with refugee community members themselves. And in part because the impact of these experiences can really be multifaceted. So you often see co-occurring, health, mental health concerns, social impact, spiritual effects. And then of course, there are the serious legal matters that need to be attended to. So I and other social workers have had the opportunity to work closely as partners with immigration attorneys, and that can be so vital, particularly if they're facing legal proceedings that you may be able to provide evidence or expert witness testimony about. So I started out more as a mental health professional, and then it was the Cambodian communities and other refugee communities who taught me, but I'll tell you who taught me that was way too narrow of a focus. So some of my Cambodian partners told me, yes, we have a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes, there's a lot of depression in our community. Of course there would be, given everything we've been through, but we're dying from stroke. We're dying from complications from diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so that really opened my eyes. This was before I became an academic, and began to shift my research also to include these co-occurring realities in the lives of the people I was working with. So that's essential, right? We each bring our own area of expertise, but it's important for that work to be coordinated and to really be a team, and not to be working, isolated from one another, because then you might be working at cross purposes, and that can have negative effects for the person and their family. It's also important, in my experience, to continue to get trained in trauma-informed treatment approaches. And I'm picking up on what Marciana was emphasizing, approaching one's work with cultural humility. I totally agree with what you were saying about that, Marciana. And that leads to learning how to engage in your work, whether it's micro work, meso, macro, but I'm going to focus more on the micro part now, that to engage in an approach to your work that's grounded in human rights and social justice. So I want to mention briefly 9 things that I think are at minimum essential to attend to in order to engage in best clinical practices with forcibly displaced persons. One, and a lot of these concepts really reinforce many of the really important things that Marciana was sharing. First is promoting human dignity and rehumanization, because often through the experience of being a forced migrant, the dignity from you is stripped away, while you're being persecuted, while you're being tortured in the midst of a war, like what we're seeing in the media every day now. And so there's many ways that one could approach this, but one thing that might be central to the work is promoting avenues for narrative and storytelling by the person themselves about their own life experience in their own words. Now, part of being trauma informed in one's approach is we can't rush that. And when it's really important, in my experience, to make sure that they have a grounding of a sense of security, safety, and also trust in you or whoever the audience may be for sharing of that story before you launch into that. Second, non-discrimination and a focus on the historically and socially excluded is essential to this approach. So one thing that clinical social workers can do, and there's many others, but one thing is to seek to lessen or eliminate, probably it's hard to eliminate, but lessen the interpersonal power differentials between yourself and the person or community that you're working with. I'm going to mention, if there's time, a few resources that will help to lay this out in a lot more detail, including with a lot of case examples that might help to make it come to life, for all of us. Third, participation and engagement. And this is more than just token participation or token getting someone to, sign an legal informed consent form, really including them in the decisions that affects their lives and well-being at every stage of the process. So as an example, I've worked with asylum seekers who had an imminent hearing with an asylum officer or in federal immigration court in front of a judge, and they weren't functioning very well yet. They weren't psychologically able to testify and be about the things that they most wanted to forget. and they wish had never happened to them. Particularly, for example, if what they experienced was stigmatizing or shameful in their culture or society. I'm talking about things like rape. Again, we're seeing that in the media now, or sexual torture, for example. But anyway, so their attorney could ask for a continuance or a delay in the case, but if they may not get their case heard for another year, 2 years, 3 more years. So it's a trade-off. And rather than, the social worker or the attorney making that decision on behalf of the asylum seeker, it's really vital to fully engage them in an informed way as to what is the best decision for themselves. Fourth, transparency, truth-seeking, and accountability. One way, I'm just going to give you one example, that is really important for clinical social workers to engage in is we must remain doing an in-depth attention to assessment, including documenting the human rights violations. And depending on the context of your work, we might be able to help build evidence either for an asylum case or for cases where the perpetrators are being prosecuted, for example. And so that could be an important part of this. And or supporting, as I and others have done, supporting the survivor themselves so that they're able to provide testimony in cases against their perpetrators. This includes folks who have fled here because of human trafficking as well. But also we need to research what rights-based interventions are appropriate and effective, for specific forcibly displaced populations and individuals, because as Marciana really, pointed out really well, there can be vast individual differences, even within families, in terms of culture and how these experiences affect a person. But it's hard because the literature still is too limited in this area. And then my last point here is we as practitioners need to thoroughly and continually evaluate and monitor our own practice. Including something I've devoted a lot of my attention to, the impact of doing this work on us and making sure that we're able to be aware of that, we can attend to that, and it does not affect our professional engagement with the refugees, asylum seekers, or other forcibly displaced individuals. That's a vital thing we need to do in our practice. I will speed up a bit here. But fifth, reframing needs as entitlements or rights. That's central to a human rights-based approach. Sixth, cultural humility and intersectionality. And Marciana already exquisitely covered that. So seventh, fostering a therapeutic relationship and reconstructing a sense of safety. What this means to me as a clinical social worker with these populations is that we need to be willing to think outside the box and to do things differently if appropriate, although still remain professional. So I was taught, just to give you a simple example, to always have the door to my therapy room shut because we value confidentiality. So it must always shut that door. However, I found in working with a number of torture survivors that might throw them into panic, that might radically increase their sense of not feeling safe, feeling locked in, because many times they would be interrogated and tortured in a closed, shut off environment. And so with one woman I worked with who was having a lot of panic attacks because she heard her husband being tortured when she was locked into a little pantry in their home. I left the door open for the first year and a half of our therapy work together. And eventually it was a real sign of her progress when she was able to tolerate that door being shut. So we need to do what is needed to do our best together, working collaboratively with the person we're serving to reconstruct a safe enough environment. Just two more points. In the provision of trauma-informed care, one of the central things that we want to be mindful of is not pathologizing the survivors. So, you know, having testified in federal immigration court a lot, often the adjudicators, the judge or others, want me to diagnose people. And a lot of the language and the diagnostic systems are very pathologizing and very much from a medical model. So while at times I might need to do that in that particular context, really normalizing, as Marciana mentioned earlier, that these reactions, you know, while causing a lot of suffering for an individual, are normal and to be expected given what they've been through. And I just want to say that quite a few of the torture survivors I've worked with have successfully been granted asylum in court without having a current mental health diagnosis because of really giving, you know, a more expansive, holistic assessment of their experiences. And finally, drawing from a recovery model and a strengths and resilience orientation. I think I'll leave it there because I know there's still other things you want to cover.
Thank you so much for those points. That was and the illustrative examples, and it's particularly the first one and the one with the both of your examples about trust make me think of here at Portland State, we have Trauma Informed Oregon, and one of my colleagues that works there has talked about moving at the speed of trust when they work with clients.
Yes. And if I can just add to that, I have to say this was so good, Megan. And, you know, like, I hope you can share the resources and, you know, like this needs to go everywhere, not only among social workers, but beyond, because this is so well put and it brings in the right space and trauma-informed perspective. And it's really, it should be the principles of social work practice with migrants and refugees. These should be the principles to be followed.
Thank you. If I might just share two resources really quickly, and I can make those available for you. But the first is a book that is in press right now that is edited by two colleagues, Nancy Murakami and Mashura Akilova. And it is called Integrative Social Work Practice with Refugees, Asylum Seekers, and Other Forcibly Displaced Persons. And it'll be coming out soon, I understand. It's published by Springer Nature. I happen to have a chapter in there which focuses on clinical work with these populations. But the book itself spans, you know, micro, meso, macro social work practice. And there are a lot of case examples and resource materials that I think social work students, practitioners, faculty members will find helpful.
Exactly. So I doubt that anyone who is in the service provision sector can say that I will not interact with the immigrant and refugees. Like it's likely that any one of us see immigrants and refugees in our profession. Investing in education and knowledge, I think it's a most important one. I know that social workers can graduate from their programs without even hearing the word refugees. So I think some level of being proactive about asking information about the specific groups of immigrants and refugees. And there are amazing initiatives that now are talking about incorporating more global concepts in social work education. CSWE is now investing on 12 scholars in global and intercultural competence to bring these concepts to classroom for social workers. I'm one of the scholars of the first cohort, so we'll receive a small grant and then receive training to incorporate global components in our teaching in social work. So these initiatives are very important. Also, students being proactive to receiving information in that area could be very helpful. We have interventions and skills that are working, and there is literature on that. For students, it's important to read that literature or join groups or listservs that share those literature. For example, my initiative has a listserv that we always send new publications on immigrants and refugees to our members. It's very easy to join. You just need to join the SSW or a special interest group on immigrants and refugees. CSWE has an amazing list of books on immigrants and refugees that was put together by Dr. Yolanda Padilla. The books are even categorized by genres. So you can say that I want to read fiction books or documentaries on refugees or forcibly displaced individuals. Words Without Border is another amazing resource that have literature based on countries, and I can send the links to all these resources to you so you can share it.
Definitely, yeah, that'll be associated with the video.
And then if a person is interested in digging deeper into some of the human rights-based approaches to clinical social work, I might refer you to a book that I wrote, published by Springer as well, in 2015 on that topic. And again, there's lots of case examples, and some of the principles that I was just talking about are described in much more depth and how one would apply them in one's work.
Great. I'll put the names of those resources associated with this video afterwards too.
That would be really good. Thank you.
Dr. Popescu, do you have any recommendations for social workers looking for more?
Yeah, well, I think, like it's really like building on this amazing, like fundamental, lecture. I took notes. Building on that, interdisciplinarity, I think it's extremely important, and we don't do enough of that, and we can do more. And with that, I also think that, as social workers, we need to remind ourselves that social work is a rights-based profession. It is also a global profession. Mm-hmm. So really understand, particularly when working with forced migration, all the existing global policies, the instruments that we have that we can work with and invoke. And yes, on one hand, human rights laws do not have, if you want the teeth, I don't like this comparison, but anyway, do not have enough enforcement mechanisms, right? But they are there. And they should be invoked and they should be known. And as social work professionals that want to work with this population, we need to know about them, right? There are currently 2 global compacts that, the international community through the UN came to. One is the Global Compact on Refugees. The other one is the Global Compact on Migration. It's called actually Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, a mouthful. And like this, both compacts, although there are many issues with them, but they exist. Again, they brought great principles together. They brought the international community together. They have amazing support and push from the civil society. So you have multiple NGOs really pushing that these compacts are being fully implemented. They are now in the implementation stage. How many schools of social work are teaching about this? And this is not even like, it's just the principles. You don't need to kind of like have the entire material, but pull the principles out and make sure that they inform our practice. I think this is extremely important. The other element, and I'll go back to one of the principles that Megan mentioned, and that's participation. I cannot stress that enough. I think it is time to really think of a model in which people with lived experiences of any kind of vulnerability, of any kind of trauma, in this case, people with lived experiences of forced migration, are becoming co-instructors with us and are teaching us first. So at Her Migrant Hub, what we managed to do, and I'm so humbled every time when I see how this works out, and I learn more from our population, from the women activists that joined us, is we asked them to actually work with social work students and with us and develop webinars through which they talk about, it's a little bit of a storytelling, but it's a little bit more systemic. No, it's not the right word. It's a little bit more systemized, structured in a way that allows women to say as much or as little as they want, but they also train. We want to use these materials to train professionals, practitioners, and then bring the practitioners at the table. There is a model that was advanced by an organization called ATD. It's All Together in Dignity, Fourth World. And they promoted this model, this framework of learning that's called merging the knowledge, right? Which means that it's not participation, it's not something which you have a token participation, as Megan said, like having a few women sharing their stories, or like signing a consent. No, merging the knowledge means that we all come with what we have and we share and we learn together. And the learning process that occurs through that is so rich, it cannot be replaced by anything else, So I do hope that in social work education and field education, we can do more of that. And then finally, integrative practice. We are working now with Catholic Charities US. They started implementing a pilot trying to look at best practices for social workers working with asylum seekers, right? But just focusing on the internship. And what we learned, and Megan and I had the opportunity to work together on a different project, and that model seems to be really good. What we learned is that you need some background support in terms of course material, concepts, right? The knowledge, right? And that could be participatory knowledge. And that's what we hope to create and, disseminate as soon as possible. But there are already other courses, I'm sure, like that, right? So, based on real stories, bringing the voices of the population to the center, then that is being followed by an internship with the population, with skills training attached to it, helping social work students to learn how to best work with the population. As Megan said, what are the best rights-based practices for specific issues related to forced migration for specific individuals, right? And then finally, it has another impact component in which we are looking, okay, so now that social work students were trained, so that their knowledge, attitudes, skills changed and improved, are they employable? And how much of a difference do they make? Employability is important from our perspective and from the student's perspective, but impact is the most important. Are we really achieving the kind of change that we believe in and that brought us to this profession? So that's all I could add.
Great.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that the audience is feeling as fortunate as I am to have heard from you today.